Welcome in the arena. My name is Allyson Klein, and today is another Data Insights episode, which means I'm with Jeniece Wnorowski. Let's go to the interview. Welcome back to the program, Jeniece.
Hi, Allyson. Thank you very much. It's great to be back, always.
So, Jeniece, why don't you tell us about what topic we've got queued up today and who we've brought along as a guest?
We are, as everyone is, right? Always, all day focused on AI. And, more and more folks out there want to understand how is AI impacting healthcare and how is healthcare being impacted by the innovations of AI. And so today we actually have Tapan Shah with us, who is an AI architect for Innovaccer. So welcome to the program, Tapan. It's really nice to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jeniece and Allyson. Really happy to be here and sharing some of my experiences.
Now, Tapan, you've got an amazing title, AI architect and agentic AI workgroup lead at, I think it's CHAI, the Coalition for Health AI. Can you give me a little bit about your role and, how that fits in with the topic of today in terms of the evolution of AI into enterprise?
Absolutely. So I'm currently the AI architect at Innovaccer, and what my role entails is creating AI systems and, like more recently, AI agents that work into actual healthcare environments, not just in a pilot setting, in actual enterprise systems wherein they get tasks done, they get work done and create value, right? And affect patient and provider outcomes. So that is my fundamental role there. It's actually very interesting to think about. And I would like to start with an example because that actually just highlights the challenges which we face. So for example, let's say you are creating a clinical note, or we have an AI generating a clinical note for a cardiology practice. Now, that works great, right? It works great in pilot. We have deployed that. And now when we move to, let's say, oncology or orthopedic, the same system probably does not work as well, right? And that is because, or even if you go to a different practice, right, a different EHR systems or a different clinical practice, which might have their own requirements and expectations, it still does not work, right? And that, in very short or summary, highlights the challenges of how scaling AI into enterprise healthcare and healthcare systems, and my role here at Innovaccer is fundamentally enabling so that we can go and use AI systems from a pilot phase to more at scale and production systems. So that's my fundamental role. And what I have also learned over the past 1.5 to 2 years where I have been working in healthcare is AI is not, especially AI in healthcare, is not about what model are you using or the model architectures or what inference engines are you using. The real hard problems are how do you ensure that the agent which we are developing, they have the right access, right? They are creating safe decisions. They are able to understand what the limitations are and answer accordingly, right? Or how does it create sufficiently transparent and explainable generations or recommendations so that even a skeptical clinician would accept that, right? So what we realize is that scaling AI over enterprise system is less of an AI problem and more of a system design problem.
Interesting.
And with that background, can you tell us a little bit about the types of AI initiatives healthcare organizations are prioritizing right now, and what's changed in how those initiatives are being validated compared to, say, a few years ago?
That's actually a very interesting question. So the big shift over the past many years, like over, let's say, 10 years, and especially since the advent of large language models, the big shift is from building models to building agents, right? And that has been, I would say, a seismic shift, which has really revolutionized the industry in some sense. Historically, AI would be used to build predictive models, for example, for tumor detection or for detecting oncology onset, etc. that was pretty easy to validate, right? You would build your models, you would have an holdout set, measure your accuracy on that set, deploy, and you are good to go, right? Now, agents are different, right? In agents, they pull information from different data sources, they use different tools or executable softwares, and they combine this to create or perform a particular task, right? Now, in this case, there is not often a single source of truth. So it becomes very difficult to validate because under the same scenario, right, using the same tools and same data, clinicians can have very different interpretations for that, right? And we have seen examples for that. There can be cases of missing data. There can be cases where certain users are not allowed to use certain tools or certain softwares. So in this, the challenge becomes, right, how do you ensure that the agents which you are building are safe, which means when it encounters something which is new or novel, it handles the scenario gracefully, right? Uh, and so you are not only computing an aggregate accuracy or a single number, you are computing or measuring the performance along a rubric of dimensions, right? And essentially, the goal here is to make sure that the agent behaves safely and predictably even in a novel scenario, right? And that has been the fundamental shift when it comes to over the past few years of how we have moved from building models to building agents, and evaluation and validation of that agents has fundamentally been trying to get robust and predictable performance in novel scenarios.
Yeah, Tapan, we've been talking to a lot of AI practitioners across verticals, and I think healthcare isn't unique in the challenge that we've had a lot of successful pilots in enterprise, but very few examples can point to scaled outcomes. So, from when you're talking to different healthcare providers, what are you seeing around the primary friction points once AI moves beyond a single department or use case?
So let me reframe your question, Allyson, and I would try to answer it slightly differently. Uh, and again, I will reiterate the example which I gave initially, right? So you have a clinical node generator, and then you use that clinical or the AI node generator to generate clinical nodes for, let's say, a particular practice for cardiology. The same AI, when we want to move it to a different practice or a different specialty, right? Then what we have often seen, right, and that's true across the board, is there are some gaps, right? And that scaling piece, right? It typically works very well in a very contained content environment to scale it across multiple EHRs, to scale it across multiple specialties, to scale it across multiple personas is where the real challenge comes in, right? And that, I think, has been the primary friction point, right? When we talk about scaling AI from pilots to enterprise systems, right? Another example I'll tell you, right? For example, if when we are building a pilot and we are building an AI agent to perform a certain task, in a pilot phase, we can provide a wide variety of access to different data sources, right? Uh, at the pilot stage. But when we go into production, right, there has to be a better access control which has to be built in. It cannot be bolted in, it has to be built in into the system, right? For example, if let's say we have a cardiology node generator, that cardiology node generator should not have access to any psychiatric or behavioral psychiatry nodes for the patient, right? So that nuance and that level of access is very important that we build it and not build it, and that, right? And that is the fundamental challenge, right? When we talk about scaling AI, is how do we do that in a responsible and a governed manner, so as to make sure we are not crossing lines when it comes to compliance, security, etc. So the technical decisions, just to summarize that, some of the technical decisions which we make during a pilot, right? If something doesn't work in pilot, we can make some changes and we can make it work. When it goes into a full-blown enterprise sector, right, it should have that ability to address new scenarios, or scenarios which are not very clear. In that scenarios, if your agent is able to work, then we can confidently say that, look, now we have moved from a pilot phase to enterprise solution phase, and that's where we create the real value.
So let's talk a little bit about governance, right? So when healthcare leaders hear governance, they often think of like controls, constraints, but in practice, what does effective AI governance kind of look like day to day, for an organization to really successfully deploy AI at scale?
That's a very valid point you bring in, Jenice, and that's a mindset shift, right? Which the leaders will also need to go over that journey. That AI governance is not constraint; in fact, it's enablement, right? And the way I think of AI governance or governance in general, uh, it's a small example, but probably it shares my thought process here. It's like a constitution, right? You can use your constitution to either be a constraint and a binding document, or you can use that constitution to be the building block for doing a lot of useful things, right? So that is what the governance actually looks like. Now, to answer our question, what does a day-to-day activity in a governance look like, right? Multiple levels. For example, let's say if you have an authorization agent, right, which adjudicates on prior authorization, we have seen, we see over a period of time that we get around 70% auto approval rate. Suddenly, one day we observe that the approval rate has increased to 90%, right? And we observe that trend over a period of time. So day-to-day governance actually means is to detect this change, right? Have a mechanism where we can identify what triggered that change, right? And for that, we need to understand the complete decisioning process, right? So, and that's another thing which is important, right? Historically, AI used to be all about the prediction, your recommendation. You go to a Netflix, this is the recommendation which I'm making for a movie. This is the recommendation or the prediction I'm making for this particular problem, right? When it comes to the agentic AI world, you are not only interested in the final recommendation or the adjudication, you are interested in the entire decision graph which was taken. What data was used? What reasoning was used? Why was this particular tool used? Why was this particular decision made? That entire decision graph. So the fact that we log the entire decision graph, the fact that we can detect a deviation from normal, and the fact we can attribute that deviation to a change in the decision graph, right, is what an actual governance would look like. Right now, in this case, the possibility or the probability would have been there had been some update in the payer guidelines, right, or some update in the payer rule, which was communicated verbally or using email, which for which we probably did not have the right insight. And in that case, right, so the fact that we could figure out the decisioning process, the fact that we could detect the deviation, and then the fact that we could identify the root cause and make appropriate modification is what a day-to-day governance, right? Another example of day-to-day governance is cost, right? Because the fact of the matter is that AI is like current AI, the way it is enabled is very token based, which means it is expensive, right? Each time you call an AI model, you spend some cents, you spend some dollars, right? And if your AI agents are not configured correctly, right, and if you don't have the right guardrails, the cost can literally blow up, right? So that is another part of governance, making sure that you have the right structures in place, the right guardrails in place to avoid any escalation in costs which are unheard of or just unknown, right? So that is another very day-to-day governance type of example which I can think of. uh, Another example again is always monitoring the outputs generated by your agent, right? Having a mechanism to continuously monitor them and flag any anomalies. So all these structures, right? In technical terms, we call it observability, tracing, and monitoring, right? As well as the corresponding policy and the cost structure. Together, they are fundamental parts of a day-to-day AI governance, which is in place.
Now, I think that the world has been captured at how quickly AI systems are becoming more autonomous, and the headlines have been filled with that. I don't want to make the entire podcast about that topic, but I do have a question. As we see the evolution of AI in real time, how are healthcare organizations evolving their approach for accountability, especially when decisions involve both clinical and administrative impact?
That's a very valid but a very tough question, Allyson.
I think it's the one that we're grappling with collectively, right?
So, and I'll tell you, so let me first explain why it is tough, right? Why it is important. And then I'll probably go into what current mechanisms which we have, right? But to answer our questions upfront, we don't have a perfect solution, right? We don't have a perfect solution of how will that accountability be there, right? When it comes to agent taking decisions. Having said that, right, we do have ways where we attribute that. But is that the perfect way? There is a lot of ongoing research happening on that space, right? And I expect that there is also research not only from academic and scientific circles, there is also research happening from the legal circles, right? That what does an agent mean and how will the same laws apply to an agent? Will they, will not? Right? And again, I'm not an expert in that front, so I'll probably not comment there. But I'll tell you how we address the problem as of now. Because it's an important problem, right? The way we address that problem is whenever a decision is taken, right, that decision needs to be logged, right? There has to be a traceability on every decision which AI takes. Like that is the fundamental, I would say, bedrock, right? On which all the accountability structures will be built on, right? Secondly, all the agents should have the right access control, the right permissions, right? They should only be accessing certain things which it is allowed to do, right? And that also has to be built in. So combined with the fact that we have a proper access control, right? And combining that with the fact that all decisions are well articulated and logged, right? Those become the bedrock of how accountability will be there. Now, the third component, right, which is very important, is human oversight, right? So as of now, for in fact, all of clinical use cases where AI agents are used, and many of the administrative use cases also, there is always a human oversight. The human can always override the decision, right? They will always be able to override a particular decision with the AI takes, and that will be sort of law. So, and again, I don't have the perfect answer for your question on that of the accountability, but what we do have is as and when the legalities of it and the governance of it evolves, the bedrock of it, right? Access control, logging of the data, and human right. These three will be the bedrocks, which will then make sure that any change in the accountability structures, those are handled and those are managed by those bedrock systems.
A lot of AI success in healthcare, right? A lot of success stories really focus on how much time did I save or how much cost did I reduce. What metrics would you say healthcare organizations use to quantify kind of long-term strategic value beyond just kind of that short-term efficiency?
So, and yes, I think right now a lot of focus is on the short-term efficiency gains, but in terms of the long-term strategic, right, I think the two main outcomes which we are looking for, which are the holy grail, are improved patient outcomes and improved provider outcomes, right? And if this is a path towards achieving that, I think we are probably on the right path, and this is what we should focus on. So when it comes to patient outcomes, right, it's a combination of cost of care, quality of care, right, and the speed of care, right, is like, I'll give you an example. For our authorizations, right, there are cases where it can take upwards of 2 to 3 weeks for a prior authorization for a procedure, right? Can we get that down? And that actually leads to delay in the care, right? So can we bring that down to, let's say, a day, less than a day, few minutes, right? And that actually impacts patient outcomes. Cost of care, right? How do we reduce a lot of administrative burden, right? Which can then reduce the cost of care. Quality of care, right? Are we identifying the right quality gaps, the right care gaps, and are we addressing those, right? So it's a combination of quality of care, its speed of care, and cost of care. When it comes to the provider world, right, that is, it's possible to quantify them, right? And again, there is some debate on what's the best way to quantify them. The way I see at it is, okay, can we help our providers to spend more time on things which they are actually good at, which is taking care of patients, which is understanding the patient condition and providing the best possible care, rather than spending an inordinate amount of time on administrative tasks, right? Can we reduce their stress levels and burnout, right? Which is an actual problem out there, and there is significant research out there which indicates that, you know, provider burnout and provider stress levels is a big problem. So can we reduce that, right? So essentially, if we can have these AI systems, right, which can make providers engage and interact more with the patients, and at the same time, right, reduce their fatigue levels, reduce their stress levels, I think those are the final outcomes which we should be looking out for, right? And again, it will be a step-by-step process, right? It will be phased over a period of time. But at least when you talk about long-term goals, these are the two goals which I believe AI can play a significant role in.
So, Tapan, I think that, one thing that I think about is healthcare organizations are pretty complex. You're touching with an AI initiative potentially multiple audiences, including clinicians, IT operators, business operations, and compliance managers, all that have maybe some competing and overlapping priorities. How do organizations align these groups around shared ownership for AI so that AI can actually become enterprise capability holistically?
And you actually bring a very good point, Allyson, there. And I'll share an example, right? So you will have, like, even in a typical system, right? You will have a security who will want a very high degree of access control and logging. You'll have a compliance team which would want proof for almost all access being made. You will have an operations team which would want a very fast response time, right? And you would probably want a clinician or a care manager who would want your solution to work across multiple EHRs, right? So these are diverse requirements, many of them competing, many of them aligned, but it's a diverse requirements. So the key goal of an architect, right, and is to make sure that when you design your AI system, when you design your AI agents, all these requirements are thought of and baked it into the system. Because if we try and bolt it over, it becomes a challenge, and then we have observed that, something fails, something does not fail, and then we sort of end up creating friction points and creating even bigger silos, right? So at the time of engineering the systems, at the time of architecting the systems, if you can make sure that that all these requirements are well architected, then you create that AI system, the AI layer, which has reduced friction. I cannot guarantee eliminating friction, but it reduces friction, right? And I'll give you an example, right? So, for example, in as part of governance, and I will again bring back those three terms, right? Observability, tracing, and monitoring, right? If we do that well, if all our agents we have great observability, we have all the perfect tracing, we have great monitoring, right? We can have each and every persona well catered, right? We can have the security team, they can do audits whenever they require. We can have the compliance team who can make sure that we are complying with the right legal framework. We can have the operations team who can get observability into what is our latency, how much is our response time when we are responding to a particular task. We can have clinicians, right? And the same framework would also provide understanding to the clinician that, okay, this agent works well on this scenarios, this agent does not work well on this scenarios. So again, going back to my point on observability, tracing, and monitoring, that is one of the key example of how well architected systems, right, will ensure that all these competing requirements or even multiple requirements in siloed organizations, they are all taken care of and they are all sort of on board when this agent goes into production.
So, Tapan, have you kind of seen examples where governance, exists on paper but doesn't translate into outcomes? And how do you bridge the gap between like the governance theater and a structure that actually scales?
That, Janice, is actually a great question and something which is very close to my heart, right? And actually,
Oh,
it's
good.
actually close to my heart, it's close to my manager's heart, and it's close to our organization, right? Just having policy frameworks and governance frameworks on pages and papers and slides and docs, it's great, it's important. But having said that, it does not, like, that has limited impact, right? What really has the impact, right, is how do you integrate in your day-to-day systems, right? And again, folks with background in software engineering, right, there is a term called CI/CD, right? It's continuous improvement, continuous development, right? How do you integrate this governance concepts as part of your CI/CD, your agile systems, your CI/CD systems? Which essentially means is that it is not an overhead. It is not something which we fit in from top. It is something which is part of an existing flow, existing workflow, right? So it's a day-to-day activity. Now, let me give you an example for that, right? Let's say an agent made a decision last Friday, right? If I am in a position to within few minutes, right, query a database, query a system, and get all the related aspects for that agent decision. What was the data use? What was the model use? What was the reasoning use? How confident was the model when it sort of made that decision? If I can get everything within few minutes, then I can safely say that I have a reasonably well good working system. But if it takes me a week or 2 weeks to get that information, then I'm sorry, that is not working a working governance system, right? It's probably there in the paper, but it's not there, right? And that's what we strive towards, right? As a company, as an organization, we have been striving towards a scenario where any decision in which AI makes, it should be available to us within a few clicks and few queries, right? Similarly, let's look at another example, right? Let's say and again, there can be documents and documents of pages on what access policies and access control should look like. But if I cannot within few minutes get what were the tools accessed by this particular AI agent, then again, that's not very helpful. And that is, or if the answer is that we will review it in a quarterly meet, that's not the answer we are looking for, right? It should be ASAP, right? So that's what when I talk about, actual governance or actual governance in the system and not just governance theater, it's about whenever I want to know about any decision made, any access of a database, any access of a tool, right, which an AI has made. If I can get that within few clicks, within few queries, then I can be safe that we have architected a well-designed, a well thought out AI system.
Now, looking ahead, how should healthcare organizations design durable governance models like what you're talking about that won't need to be reinvented as AI capabilities evolve? I love what you've said about integration into CI/CD, but as the landscape changes, does that just evolve and push forward the CI/CD pipeline, or how do you see that evolving?
Great question again, Allyson. And the way I think about governance is it cannot be tied into an implementation, right? Governance cannot be like, if there is a governance policy which says that you should always use a RAG, right? Or retrieval augmented generation, or your confidence score should always be computed using this, then that's a recipe for tech debt, right? Because things will evolve, and what implementations which we are using today, they will no longer be useful, right? So the key aspect here is to understand tying up the governance with the interface rather than with the implementation, right? I'll give you an example, right? So probably 3 years ago, I would control data access at the database level, right? Today, I control it via a API level. So the technology has evolved, but the fundamental principle of access control still remains, right? So as long as we can get the right principles, right, and make sure those principles are well highlighted, well documented, right, and not tie up our governance on implementations, I think we should be good there, right? And again, many of these principles are not AI specific, right? Uh, so observability, decisioning, tracing, monitoring, these are age-old concepts, age-old good software engineering concepts which have always been there, right? When you move towards an AI or an agentic AI world, right, the interpretations become slightly different, but these are basic system design concepts. And that's the reason in the initial part, I think I remember I mentioned, when you scale AI agents into an enterprise world, it is less of an AI problem, it is more of a system design problem, right? And as long as those fundamental aspects of system design, it comes to robustness, right? For example, let's say you call a model API, the model API fails, right? That model API, you can today use OpenAI, you can today use Claude, you can use your own model, right? But the fact that you should have a robust retry mechanism, a robust fallback mechanism, right? Those are fundamental system design problems, and those still remain valid. So as long as your governance implement are based upon this solid system design principles, right? And you don't tie your governance with specific implementations, I think we should be good there.
Amazing. This has been an incredibly rich conversation, Tapan. We appreciate it so much. Where can our listeners go to learn more information about everything that was discussed today?
Absolutely. So for some of the compliance fundamentals and AI governance stuff, there is a special publication by NIST, right? It's 806. It's a great resource, right? Even HHS has published newer guidelines for HIPAA for the AI world. Again, that's a good starting point. CHAI, right? Coalition of Health AI, for which I am the agentic AI lead there. It has some very good resources on agentic AI and agentic AI governance. It's a great resource there. And again, so I would also want to highlight, so Innovaccer, we recently released, last year released an AI platform, right, which is called as Gravity. And if you go to some of the blogs we have released as part of that, right, that highlights how deeply we have thought about governance, security, compliance, and we have built it bottoms up by design. Because many a times what we see around is governance and aspects of governance become afterthoughts and they are bolted in, right? But we have fundamentally flipped the game and we have thought about those aspects first before even we put out the first agent, right? We wanted to, because we know how critical healthcare and how what levels of compliance and security are expected when it comes to healthcare, and we want to make sure that our platform enables that. So that's another great resource we should look out for.
Thank you so much for being on the show today. It was so fascinating to hear your journey thus far in the healthcare AI arena and where we're going. I love that you shared your expertise. I'm sure folks will find it useful as well. We'd love to have you back on the show sometime.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you, Allyson, Jeniece, and have a very good day ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And with that, that's another episode of Data Insights.